Good evening, everyone. If I could have your attention for a moment, please. You're all very welcome. I'm Ronnie Witherup. I'm the president of the Charitable Society, and I welcome you to this wonderful place this evening. There's a few preliminaries, if I may. First of all, no planned fire alarms, so if anything happens, please follow the staff. We will direct you downstairs to the exits. Bathrooms out on the right outside the door. Mobile phones, switch off, please. And also a very good welcome, a very good evening to everyone who happens to be joining us by Zoom this evening. I understand we've got a good audience there as well as in the room. So for their information, everyone will be muted at the start of the talk. Please maintain mute at your own end so there's no interruptions. Ensure your camera is switched off and use the chat function at the end. And then I'll monitor any questions that come through on the chat function. And for everyone, Zoom and otherwise, we're recording today's event. So those are the formalities now. It's my pleasure to welcome John Gray, who's going to deliver this evening's talk on the Age of the Enlightenment. And I'm glad to see such a full house here, well, bar two seats, perhaps. And thank you all for your attendance. Just a small word on the Enlightenment. Now, Dr. Lauren Smith is employed by the Charitable Society. Where has she gone? She's left the room. She's given me a speaking note on the Age of the Enlightenment. I'm going to read it to you. This is her take on the Age of the Enlightenment. John might have a word to say about it, but here it goes. The Enlightenment represented a widespread journey of intellectual exploration and freedom across Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. It brought about novel perspectives in philosophy, science, political thought. Primarily, the human ability to reason was emphasized as the means through which we could expand our understanding, preserve individual liberty, and achieve happiness. It can be argued that by the early 18th century, an Irish aspect to this movement surfaced. This took its most radical form in Belfast during the 1780s, 1790s. Significant influences included Francis Hutchinson, who advocated for the right to resist oppressive governance, opposition to slavery, the inherent goodness of individuals, particularly the children. Additionally, Thomas Paine's Rights of Man became regarded as the Quran of Belfast, in quotation marks. But we will learn more, of course, about the Enlightenment in John's talk. So thank you, Lauren, for producing that paragraph for me. If I may just be permitted to add a word to link us back to Belfast and to the Charitable Society. The name Francis Hutchinson was mentioned there, and you're probably familiar, if you're attending this lecture, I expect you already know about Francis Hutchinson. Well, he was the father. His father was the Reverend John Hutchinson, and he was a Presbyterian minister in Downpatrick. Francis himself went to university in Glasgow, as all the Presbyterians had to do at that time, as they weren't allowed to go to Trinity. And when he left, he founded an academy, a Presbyterian academy in Dublin, where he taught for 10 years. And he wrote some of his texts while he was in that post. But eventually he left and became professor of moral philosophy at the Glasgow University, where he remained until his death at quite a young age, because that was in 1746. Now, with accompanying him when he was at university was a man called Thomas Drennan, and he became the Reverend Thomas Drennan after he had qualified. He too was a partner in the Presbyterian College in Dublin, and he remained there for those 10 years. As I've said, Hutchinson went to Glasgow, but Drennan came to Belfast, and he became minister of the First Presbyterian Church in Belfast, the building that still stands in Rosemary Street. And it was here in the 18th century. He came here and brought with him what is called the New Light approach. That is the non-subscribing version of Presbyterianism, non-subscription to any creed other than the Bible. And we may hear a little more about that. He came here and he remained at the church until he died in Rosemary Street, and he died in 1768. But his assistant for a time, and the man who succeeded him, was the Reverend James Mackay. And the Reverend James Mackay was one of the first assistants, as they were called, board members of the Belfast Charitable Society, which was incorporated in 1774. And at that time, they included the Presbyterian ministers in Rosemary Street on the board of the Charitable Society. So Mackay, who had succeeded Drennan, became one of 9 named assistants at that time. And as for Drennan himself, well, his son was William Drennan. And you probably know of William Drennan as well, because he was the United Irishman Drennan, but he was also the physician to the Belfast Charitable Society. And he served here, introduced inoculation at the time into the home because of the prevalence of smallpox at that time, the development of inoculation at that time. So a connection that I tried to draw from the Enlightenment figure of Francis Hutchinson through the Drennans to the Charitable Society. Now, our speaker this evening is John Gray, and he's chair of the Reclaim the Enlightenment group in Belfast. It's a charity that was founded in 2017. And he's a former librarian of the Lennon Hall Library, which he tells me he retired from all of 18 years ago. John is a great supporter of the Charitable Society. He's been here many times. He is a speaker and an author about local history. So may you welcome John Gray for his talk this evening, Belfast and the Enlightenment.
Well, thanks, Mark, very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, or perhaps in the style of the times we're talking about, I should call you citizens, sort of gender neutral for a start. It's entirely appropriate that we should meet here. Our chairman tonight has sort of pointed out some of the reasons why. If there is one institution in Belfast that still carries the legacy of the 18th century Enlightenment, both physically in its building, but in its spirit and what it does, it's the Belfast Charitable Society. And I'll speak more about the society. We do, of course, have to ask, was there even an Irish Enlightenment, let alone one in Belfast? Certainly the French philosophers such as Voltaire and Montesquieu were very dubious on the subject. They looked rather to the mixed British constitution as a model, and that as compared with their own absolute monarchy. I mean, quite naturally, a mixed constitution was a lot better than what they had in France. In fact, as Ireland entered more stable times in the 18th century, an eclectic group of thinkers emerged who in their various ways developed new and rational ideas about the world they lived in. They chafed at how the use of Ireland's increased resources was constrained by the continued control of Westminster and at the unreformed nature of the Irish Parliament. Some formed the Patriot Party in the Irish Parliament, though as 2/3 of the seats were in the gift of the aristocracy, they were always in a minority. They sought to improve Irish agriculture and the economy generally. As Dublin grew rapidly to become the second city in the empire, it was appropriate that it gave birth to a truly enlightened institution, the Royal Irish Academy. Founded in 1785, it actually received the royal imprimatur only a year later. It had aristocratic support as well as democratic support. It aimed to engage in the promotion and investigation of the sciences polite literature, and antiquities, as well as the encouragement of discussion and debate between scholars of diverse backgrounds and interests. But is there anything specific to Belfast? At the latter end of the 18th century, conditions here, and notably the disaffection of the disenfranchised Presbyterian majority in the town, was almost an absolute majority, did trigger a distinctive trajectory. Their town was ostensibly governed by a corrupt corporation consisting of 12 burgesses, all nominated by Lord Donegal, and all members of the Church of Ireland. They were also the entire electorate for the 2 Belfast seats in the Irish Parliament. Belfast was in effect a rotten borough. Politically, Belfast was the founding centre of both the Irish Volunteer Movement in 1778 and the United Irishmen in October 1791. Ideologically, the town looked to the most radical Irish philosophers and to dissenting clergy, but it also drew on the English Republican tradition and on ideas emerging further afield. Wherein lay the genesis of their agenda. The first Irish Republicans were actually Presbyterians who arrived in Dublin with Cromwell's army. Given Cromwell's reputation, that is hardly an origin story for republicanism that appeals to Irish nationalism. I was actually invited to Wexford in 2016 to a seminar on the meaning of a republic, year to mark the 100th anniversary of the rebellion. And I recounted this origin story of Irish republicanism. And I have to say, before a Wexford audience, it went down like a lead balloon. But there you are. But those Presbyterians were literally king killers who had supported the execution of Charles I and the abolition of hereditary monarchy. There was as our chairman has already pointed out, there was a direct link between those founding Dublin Presbyterian congregations and Belfast. Some of those families moved north, among them the Drennans. The father of William Drennan, the framer of the United Irish Oath, became minister of the First Presbyterian Church in Belfast. The young William had not forgotten the king-killing tradition of his forebears. In the 1770s, he and others attended a dinner to celebrate the anniversary of the execution of Charles I. Later, anonymous articles appeared in the United Irish newspaper, the Northern Star, signed Algernon Sidney. Many of the readers of the Star would actually have recognized the significance of that name. Who was Sidney then? He was one of those who had taken part in the trial of Charles I, though he'd later fallen out with Cromwell, accusing him of dictatorship. Following the Restoration in 1660, he had for long remained in exile, entirely unrepentant of his view that, as death is the greatest evil that can befall a person, monarchy is the worst evil that can befall a nation. He returned to England and continued to agitate and was arrested in 1683. The discovery of his treatise, Discourses Concerning Government, in which he argued that general consent is the ground of all just governments, sealed his fate and he was executed. William Drennan was to have his own troubles with the law when he was prosecuted for sedition in 1794. He drew up a statement in his defense. Actually, it was so provocative that his defense lawyer didn't use it, but it survives. And in it, he described his father's and his own philosophical influences. These included the Reverend John Abernethy, a key figure in the breakaway of the non-subscribing Presbyterians from the main body of the church. They rejected any man-made catechism that might interfere with reasoned interpretation of the Bible, and most notably the Westminster Confession of Faith, with its anti-Catholic strictures. Abernethy was emphatic. He was against all laws that, upon mere differences of religious opinion and forms of worship, excluded men of integrity and ability from serving their country. And as we've already heard, on a far more wide-ranging strand in the development of a radical philosophy owed much to Francis Hutcheson. Well, we've heard about his background. The key points were that he was convinced of the inherent goodness of humanity, something that was evident in children, and hence rejected the doom-mongering of original sin. He differed from John Locke in believing that the populace did not require undue constraint because of their inherent badness. No original sin, no required to dragoon the populace. Among the propositions that he advanced were that action is best which procures the greatest happiness for the greatest numbers. That was to remain a mantra for reformers well into the 19th century, and would do well to abide with it today. He insisted on the natural equality of all men, and hence was a vehement opponent of slavery, which for him was a reason for abhorrence and indignation. His views on government were to have particular significance. Civil power can scarcely be constituted justly any other way than by consent of the people. Rulers have no other sacred rights or majority than what may arise from this. The people have the right of defending themselves against the abuse of power. The people's right of resistance is unquestionable. Indeed, there was a right of universal insurrection against perfidious trustees. If you had perfidious trustees, Belfast Charitable Society, I mean, Hutcheson would be advocating an immediate rebellion. He reflected on colonial rights too. If the mother country attempts anything oppressive towards a colony, and the colony be able to subsist as a sovereign state by itself, the colony is not bound to remain subject any longer. Well, we've heard how he became chair of moral philosophy at Glasgow University, where he was hugely influential. He educated a whole generation of students, and amongst them were the Irish candidates for the Presbyterian ministry. Some were to become key supporters of the United Irish enterprise, but his impact was much wider than that. Adam Smith, a key figure in the Scottish Enlightenment, acknowledged his debt to Hutcheson. Other students travelled to America, and Hutcheson's works became key texts for those who spearheaded the American Revolution, as did Algernon Sidney's discourses. Ideas from afar quickened the pace. The American Revolution, in which many recently emigrated Ulster Presbyterians took part, was followed by the seminal fall of the Bastille in 1789 and the commencement of the French Revolution. A particular significance of French events was that they revealed that a Catholic people were capable of striking out for liberty, a point made very eloquently by Wolfe Tone in his hugely influential pamphlet of 1791, An Argument on Behalf of the Catholics of Ireland. Only a couple of generations earlier, the Williamite or Glorious Revolution of 1688 had taken place. In Tone's view, a botched job. But now other and more progressive revolutions had occurred in quick succession. The United Irishman was soon to argue that, by consulting history and reason, we see that revolutions have succeeded each other at intervals since our first knowledge of the existence of man. To suppose them to stop now, and that man hath arrived at the highest point of moral and political improvement, would be to make a supposition which could proceed from nothing but insanity. One of the key figures in encouraging the American revolutionaries had been Thomas Paine. Now an enthusiastic supporter of the French Revolution, he was provoked into addressing English conditions by the publication in 1790 of Edmund Burke's Reflections on the French Revolution, a searing condemnation of events there and a justification of hierarchical government in the face of the swinish multitude. In Ulster, the swinish multitude became a derisive song as the United Irishmen marched on their way to the Battle of Antrim in 1798. They sang the swinish, we are the swinish multitude. Burke's work was seen as an immense provocation. And so Paine responded in 1791 with his The Rights of Man. As described by Wolfe Tone, it became the Koran of Belfast. Well, that may be hyperbole, but he sold an immense number of copies in Ireland. Amongst his 32 propositions were a defense of the inalienable human rights of all citizens and vehement opposition to the hereditary monarchy and aristocracy, opposition to foreign wars, taxation of the rich rather than the poor, even a social welfare system, and education for all. I suppose amongst the list of influences here in Belfast, we should add Jonathan Swift. Tone described Belfast as Bleef Fuscu in his journal, while David Manson, the town's progressive teacher, named his cottage on the shores of Belfast Lough Lilliput. Both, of course, were islands in Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Swift, after his brief and unhappy stay at Kilroot, was no friend of Presbyterianism, but his savage wit and critiques of English economic policy towards Ireland had a particular appeal. And perhaps most notably, his modest proposal of 1729, in which he suggested that the Irish poor could relieve their condition by selling their babies to be eaten by the English elite. Beyond the raw politics of the time, the citizens of Belfast were creating an enlightened proto-republic of their own. In the absence of any effective governance by the corporation, they had to do it themselves. To the fore was Clifton House, where we are, home of the Belfast Charitable Society, and of the Poor House. It provided such social welfare as was available at the time, but did much else besides, including managing the town's water supply. Then there was the Belfast Library and Society for Promoting Knowledge, of today's Linen Hall Library, in fact, founded by, as two versions have it, intelligent artisans or sans-culottes in 1788, as the Belfast Reading Society, and very like the other little reading societies that were springing up all over Antrim and Down, it was colonized by the merchant class, who gave it its more all-embracing title in 1792. Now, the merchants may have embraced it, but it had an extraordinarily democratic constitution. The committee was subject to re-election every month. You know, they were not going to get away with anything. The democracy was going to keep control of this library. It had enormous ambitions. Indeed, it provided a library, but with an emphasis on the materials relating to our own country, i.e. Ireland, and they aimed to collect Irish manuscripts. They also planned to provide a museum, and they operated Belfast's first meteorological station. In all this, they could be seen as imitating the Royal Irish Academy, but they had no aristocratic patronage, let alone a royal imprimatur. It was a much more democratic model. And you know, that all these ambitions existed at a time when they had no permanent premises. I mean, in addition to that, they aimed for free and universal education. I'm not quite sure whether they aimed at the Belfast Library and Society for promoting knowledge. So they planned to promote knowledge, but could they really provide free and universal education when they hadn't even got premises of their own? But the ambition was there. That's the crucial thing. Then there were the three Presbyterian meeting houses in Rosemary Lane. They were often to the fore as hotbeds of reformist zeal. But in what remained a deeply religious community, there were constraints. When Thomas Paine published his Age of Reason in 1794, preferring deism to organized religion, even though radicals were dismayed. I suppose one might add David Manson's progressive school. Largely self-taught, he appears to have adopted the Hutchesonian philosophy. He educated both boys and girls and engaged in no physical punishments. True, his pupils could be elevated to become kings and queens, but crucially, this was on merit alone, not on the basis of hereditary succession. Amongst his pupils were the McCracken children. It was a society that embraced cultural diversity. Presbyterians largely subscribed for the construction of Belfast's first Catholic chapel, St. Mary's, in 1784. Robbie Burns was first published outside Scotland by the Belfast Newsletter, and his radicalism encouraged a whole generation of Ulster Weaver poets writing in Ulster Scots. Meanwhile, others went to Irish language classes, and Belfast saw the publication of the first ever periodical in the Irish language. Leading figures rallied together to organise the last ever gathering of the blind harpers of Ireland in the Assembly Rooms in 1792, and crucially engaged Edmund Bunting to transcribe their music, a foundation to traditional Irish music today. On an individual level, the spirit of inquiry and invention was afoot. We find the leading United Irishman, Thomas Russell, finding time to observe the growth of peas, engaging in geological speculation, and bloodletting experiments with his friend James MacDonald. Given Russell's later fate, it sort of seems rather macabre, but there you are. And worse still, MacDonald actually subscribed for his capture. That was one friendship that sort of didn't last the full pace. But there was another friend of Russell's, John Templeton of Cranwell, who was a pioneer botanist, exploring the plants of Ireland and tabulating and drawing, just one element of scientific discovery. Consider too that progressive teacher, David Manson. You'd have thought all his time would have been occupied with his growing school, but out in Lilliput, he ran a bowling green, and he also invented a sort of elevating platform. I haven't got a detailed description of it, but the point was it raised you into the sky so that you could get a better view. And his other invention was something which we have a picture of, was something called a velocipede. It's rather like one of those scooters that now runs over people in the streets, except it didn't actually have a battery, but it was a superior kind of scooter. Well, can you imagine any teacher today running a bowling green, building an elevator for people to get a better view and, inventing scooters? No, I can't. Anyway, it was against this background that the United Irishmen rose to prominence in the 1790s. But what are they remembered for? For much of modern Irish history, they have simply been remembered for their undoubted courage, nay, heroism or foolhardiness, depending on your perspective, in rising in armed rebellion for the independence of Ireland from British rule. All that is true, but many of those who have celebrated their endeavour have held deeply conservative views, which are the absolute antithesis of what the United Irishmen actually stood for. The United Irishmen, of course, went down to disastrous defeat, and hence could be remembered as just one of the litany of defeats in what has so often been described as 800 years of English oppression. How often have we heard that one? But they were different. They did not see themselves as part of that endless continuum. As Wolfe Tone put it, we thought much about our posterity, little about our ancestors. Are we forever to walk like beasts of prey over the fields that these ancestors stained with blood? For him, a new age had dawned. They were modernizers who looked starkly forward. No weeping over the fate of the former Irish chieftains for them. Certainly their pursuit of a brotherhood of affection embracing Protestants, Catholics, and dissenters represented a profound challenge to all that had gone before. Founded in October 1791, they enjoyed an all too brief period of a year and a half of open politics before England declared war on France in March 1793 and the onset of repression, which drove them underground. During 1792, great town meetings were held which endorsed immediate emancipation for all, including and crucially for Roman Catholics, and another held to mark Bastille Day and unanimously supporting the French Revolution. A quarter of the population of Belfast attended that meeting in the central courtyard of the White Linen Hall on the site of today's City Hall. Among other things, they were supporters of the separation of church and state, of free, universal, and non-sectarian education, of justice before the law, of a free press. They were vehement opponents of slavery. They were opponents of foreign wars. They were internationalists. They were multicultural in outlook. There were opponents of this trajectory, most notably Henry Joy, owner and editor of the Belfast newsletter, and his cousin, William Bruce, minister of the First Presbyterian Church. Their views were encapsulated in the publication of their Belfast Politics in 1794, which included a series of essays on the British Constitution, which they defended. Yet they had come from much the same stable as the radical leaders. They had both been leading figures in the volunteer movement. Even now, they were careful not to break too dramatically with the radicals. They resolutely defended both the American and French revolutions and condemned the unreformed Irish Parliament. Yet still they defended the unwritten and mixed British Constitution, with its hereditary monarch subject to the restraints of the predominantly hereditary House of Lords and of the elected but unreformed House of Commons. They argued that it provided for stability, thus avoiding the risks of any new age. They also argued that the system had a capacity for reform and quoted Machiavelli to urge this possibility. Though they criticized Edmund Burke's polemic on the French Revolution as intemperate, they weren't going to risk actually praising Edmund Burke. They actually, in essence, adopted his constitutional view. Yet by 1794, their arguments were being undermined by events. They offered a vigorous defense of the volunteer movement, and yet the volunteers had been suppressed in March 1793, and Belfast had been placed under military guard. Meanwhile, there was no prospect of parliamentary reform. In considering the case for republics, they fell back on the case of the Athenian Republic of classical times. Evidently, it had not been a success. They found no modern examples except now in the United States and France. And in considering them, there was a marked inconsistency. They were full of praise for the American Constitution, perhaps because it was largely modelled on the British one. Yes, indeed, it was a mixed constitution, but it was devoid of the hereditary element that they viewed as essential in a British context. And instead of a monarch, it had an elected president. Perhaps the universal suffrage of the new French Republic, which was what particularly offended them. They saw the French model as leading to nothing but war and the undermining of commerce. Their position did involve a complete rejection of any notion of the universal rights of man. They lumped the propertyless with the females and minors who are justly excluded from the exercise of political power. For them, the problem was that these unreflecting and improvident sons of poverty formed the great numerical majority of the community. Consequently, an unqualified suffrage would actually throw into their hands the great weight of political power. This would mean the surrender of government to the mismanagement of an uninformed multitude. See, the word multitude comes up again. They don't actually use the term swinish multitude, but they're being nearly as nasty as Burke. And to possible despotism. The condition of the poor, that majority, was in any case apparently their own fault. Absolute poverty in almost every instance is the result of gross ignorance or habitual misconduct. So, bad luck, you ones. Crucially, too, they were only prepared to emancipate Catholics gradually and from time to time, and as speedily as the circumstances of the country and the welfare of the whole kingdom will permit. And they did not suggest when that time would arrive. Given Bruce's views, it was unlikely to be any time soon. that portion of the Irish community being so much greater than the rest, a full extension of the rights of man would at one stroke transfer every power of government from the most tolerant to the least tolerant, from the most to the least enlightened part of the state, from the Protestants to the Roman Catholics of Ireland. In putting forward their arguments in 1794, Bruce and Joy made it clear that they were not going to entertain the indignant multitude. They thought they had chosen an auspicious moment, that the United Irishmen had overreached themselves and deservedly suffered the consequences. In fact, they badly misjudged the situation, as the United Irishmen reorganized and rapidly grew in strength. Of course, we can never tell how the United Irishmen would have actually exercised power if they had succeeded. And this, unlike their French counterparts, their women who had been to the fore in the early stages of the revolution were sent to the guillotine, and Tom Paine nearly suffered the same fate. Notions of democracy were supplanted by the imperial impetus of the Napoleonic dictatorship. Now, here we are merely left with the unfulfilled ideals of the United Irishmen. And because their presence in the public arena was so brief, some of these were works in progress. What is also true is that in its early stages, their would-be revolution was a bourgeois one. Indeed, the typeface used for their celebrated newspaper, the Northern Star, was actually called bourgeois. There was an underlying more radical progression, marked by the establishment of a Jacobin club. And once the movement was driven underground, the sans-culottes, the men of no property, were necessarily embraced. Thomas Russell, writing in July 1793, was an early advocate. From all I can see, the men of property all through Ireland, whether landed or commercial, are decidedly against a struggle which might risk that and will do nothing. The people are beginning to see this, and in time when they feel their strength and injuries will do it themselves, and then adieu to property. Tom was initially very much less enthusiastic. He agreed that nothing can be expected from the country except from the sans-culottes. But as far as he was concerned, they're too ignorant for any thinking man to see in power. It was only later, when in exile in France, that he more or less came round to Russell's view. If the men of property will not support us, they must fall. We can support ourselves by aid of that numerous and respectable class of the community, the men of no property. The men of no property have now become respectable. But what about the women? A Belfast edition of Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women was published in Belfast and favourably reviewed in the Northern Star. We do know that Mary Ann McCracken sent copies of Wollstonecraft's works to her imprisoned brother, Henry Joy, and chided him about the relegation of women to separate United Irish societies rather than enabling them to join the main ones. It does seem doubtful that the United Irishmen's universal enfranchisement would have extended to women. We can certainly remember them for their aim for the independence of Ireland from England, but this was no narrow, ourselves alone aim. They were internationalists and supported the struggle of other nations for freedom. They sought to ally their struggle with that of radicals in England and Scotland. The nation they sought to create was a multicultural one. This was an absolute antithesis to later narrow nationalisms that emerged from the mid-19th century onwards, based on notions of an ethnically pure race of Catholic Gaels or alternatively one of Protestant Ulster Scots and Anglo-Saxons. If a united Ireland is ever to emerge, the original United Irish blueprint will be crucial to its success. Their opposition to hereditary monarchy and aristocracy was clear-cut. We in the North are, of course, still privileged to have our monarchy, and hereditary aristocrats still hold legislative power in our British House of Lords. It's the biggest parliamentary chamber in the world, I think, except for the Chinese Assembly. I've forgotten what the Chinese Assembly is called, but I suspect it might even be marginally more undemocratic than our House of Lords. But of course, if you think about it, the flummery and the nonsense of hereditary monarchy and hereditary aristocracy, it doesn't diminish. Everything that Paine said about it is still true today. Hereditary is no guarantee of competence. One generation can be brilliant, the next can be idiots, the next can be spendthrifts. Very often they are spendthrifts because they're brought up from this totally privileged environment. Look, I won't go on, but there's something badly wrong there. And, you know, one thing about the Irish Revolution, when it came, it may have done nothing much except paint the pillar boxes green, but they did at least get rid of the hereditary monarchy. And if you want an example of actually how something else might function rather well, I think I can point to the recent history of the Irish presidents, where, you know, the people have the choice, and they've actually managed to choose at least 3 successive presidents who've made a difference and who've been highly intelligent, civilized, and have helped lead the country insofar as the role allows them to in progressive directions. Their opposition, the United Irishmen's opposition to slavery, was emphatic. Famously, they hosted the freed slave, Ulada Equiana, in 1791. They actually brought him to a meeting of the board here in Clifton House. He was being shown how the institutions of Belfast proto-republic worked, and at the same time, he was here as an example of how intelligent and able free Black people were and how they needed to be treated as equals. It's interesting that Ulada Equiana was actually himself a progressive. He was a member, before he came over here, of the London Corresponding Society, which was the radical body in London that was actually subsequently more or less suppressed during the White Terror that went on in England. Enough about Ulada, but there were contradictions about Belfast's position on slavery. Our first industrial revolution, and one in which key United Irish figures were involved, was based on cotton, a slave product. One leading merchant, Waddell Cunningham, who was the first president of Belfast Chamber of Commerce, actually owned a slave plantation on Dominica, which he called Belfast. Thank you very much, Waddell. On the abolition of slavery in the colonies in 1833, 151 Irish slave owners received almost £800,000 in compensation for the loss of their property. The slaves received no compensation for the loss of their liberty. When the celebrated escaped slave Frederick Douglass visited Belfast in the 1840s, he did receive an enthusiastic reception. One issue he raised provoked controversy. Presbyterians who had emigrated to the southern states and became slave owners had sent money back for evangelical work in the British Isles. Now Douglas urged, send the money back. Posters went up in Belfast with the slogan, send the nigger back. Irish citizens, both Catholic and Protestant, increasingly became implicated in the colonial and imperial expansion of the latter half of the 19th century, in which actually Ulster played a very prominent role. One and dominant strand of post-Enlightenment thinking, and in particular in Belfast, was that this was in fact a civilizing mission. But it was one that presumed white superiority, and arguably the origins of racist attitudes that still dog us today lie in this period. The alternative and truly enlightened critique of colonial expansion was lost sight of until modern times. Mary Ann McCracken was still handing out anti-slavery leaflets at the docks in 1859, but she noted that Belfast, once so celebrated for its love of liberty, is now so sunk in the love of filthy lucre that there are but 16 or 17 female anti-slavery advocates. 3 out of 4 Belfast newspapers supported the Confederate side in the American Civil War, the slave-owning side. The United Irishmen insisted on the need for the separation of church and state. This for long remained entirely unfulfilled. I think it's reasonable to say that after partition, Ireland consisted of 2 deeply conservative theocratic states. In the last 30 years, the Republic has largely thrown off these shackles, but in the North, the Good Friday Agreement, and perhaps of necessity, enshrined religious identity in its provisions. The result is far from the brotherhood of affection that the United Irishmen hoped for. They supported free, universal, and non-sectarian education. Henry Joy McCracken ran a short-lived and pioneering school for poor children. His sister Mary was involved in numerous similar initiatives during her long life, but these had only marginal impact. It was only in the second half of the 20th century that free secondary education was provided north and south. In the north, the transfer test, or 11 plus, based on entirely bogus science, continues to separate the haves and have-nots, leading to the existence of a significant underclass with no qualifications. In both jurisdictions, the churches maintain undue control within the educational system. While lip service is paid to the desirability of integrated education, and there is popular demand for it, it remains inadequately provided for. The United Irishmen were pioneers of a free press. Their newspaper, the Northern Star, had a reasonable claim to be Ireland's first modern newspaper. Each issue, it was reckoned, reached 200 people. How come? Well, it was distributed all around the north, and one person would get it. Because even the Northern Star was quite expensive once you had to pay the government tax on it. That's one way the government restricted access to newspapers, by putting a tax on. So you'd have one person who had the Northern Star, and then he'd meet up with all the other boys, mainly boys, and would read it out to them. So each issue could have had an audience of 200. It was, of course, smashed up by the Monaghan militia with government support in 1797. Subsequently, all newspapers in Ireland received secret government subsidies for 20 years to toe the line. There was a long subsequent history of suppressions and prosecutions, and in Northern Ireland under the Special Powers Act. Under pressure, self-censorship often prevailed. There are still, of course, problems, as in the notable recent case of Trevor Burney and Barry McCaffrey, who made a groundbreaking documentary on the Lochen Island massacre. They were wrongly arrested by the PSNI and received major compensation. It subsequently transpired that the police were tapping the phones of journalists and lawyers. United Irishmen demanded justice before the law. Some hope for them was manifestly unfulfilled in their own time, most notoriously in the case of the judicial murder of William Orr in 1797. Others simply suffered torture and summary execution or the judgment of rigged juries. In the modern era, both Irish states used internment without trial and non-jury trials. In the North, state authorities continue to restrict access to key evidence in a plethora of cases, though the Northern judiciary has recently shown a commendable independence in challenging this omerta, more power to their elbows. Meanwhile, issues relating to justice for the victims of the Troubles remain unresolved. In the absence of state provision, the United Irishmen and others were to the fore in pioneering charitable provision across the fields of poor relief, care of the destitute, and of children in education and medicine. They freely wrote in English and Ulster Scots and sought to encourage the revival of the Irish language. They learned French. They viewed these strands as natural and complementary. They would have abhorred the present context in the North, where all too often language issues are weaponized. They opposed engagement in foreign wars, and most notably that waged against the French from 1793 onwards. They claimed a right to bear arms, and in the volunteer movement, that same right to bear arms was claimed by both the Irish volunteers and the Ulster Volunteer Force in their diametrically opposed causes in the early 20th century. And the modern IRA and the UVF looked to historical precedents. Perhaps most disastrously, the right to bear arms was enshrined in the American Constitution. We all know of the continued bloodbath of innocence that stems from that. It is then a dangerous legacy from 18th century circumstance, especially if the right to bear arms is framed as an absolute right in all circumstances. And then there is the eloquence and wit of the United Irishmen. I would argue that any progressive movement in Ireland would do well to emulate their élan. Inevitably acting more than 2 centuries ago, enlightened radicals could not lay down a blueprint for all that is required in modern society. Understandably, they viewed government as an oppressive force. Indeed, some Presbyterians took the view that any need of government at all only arose because of the sinfulness of man. And in lieu of government, they relied on charitable endeavor. In fact, both post-partition states continued to take a minimalist view of the role of the state. We all now know how inadequate and even disastrous over-reliance on charitable endeavors, and in particular on the churches, proved to be. The shrinking of the state remains an objective of conservatives and has often been a dominant theme in the politics of the United States, and never more so than at present. The desire on this island to ape American practice remains an ever-present threat to the welfare of our people. The United Irishmen were enthusiasts for free trade. They were at best equivocal on whether market forces should trump all other considerations. In 1792, Belfast's first trade unionists went on strike. The United Irishmen favoured arbitration, but when some employers refused to engage, The United Irishmen insisted that the brutal Combination Act had to take precedence, and at least 2 strikers were flogged through the streets. Of course, the ultimate catastrophe caused by a rigid insistence on the efficacy of the free market came with the free famine. The effect was genocidal indeed, but the cause was absolute reliance on the free market. Yet at least until recently, neoliberal advocacy of unfettered capitalism has remained dominant. Those who argue for it claim a mandate from that pioneer Enlightenment economist, Adam Smith, the pupil of Francis Hutcheson. They choose to ignore Smith's recognition of moral duties and the need to constrain the free operation of the market in certain circumstances. It was only after the defeat of the United Irishmen in 1798 that Bruce and Joy's restrictive views came to achieve a gradual dominance. Their intervention has correctly been identified by John Bew in his introduction to a 2005 edition of Belfast Politics as an important precursor to the subsequent emergence of an increasingly dominant unionist politics. But in its rejection of any concept of universal human rights, that can hardly be described as enlightened. The Act of Union in 1801 safeguarded Irish Protestants from the Catholic majority on the island of Ireland. As Henry Joy later noted, a Protestant majority was guaranteed in the United Kingdom against any Catholic ascendancy. That act failed to provide even minimal relief for Catholics. The government itself had hoped to include Catholic emancipation in a parallel deal, but thanks to that much vaunted mixed British constitution, the hereditary monarch was able to veto any such step. Thus, emancipation, and indeed limited parliamentary reform, was delayed for another 30 years, and arguably in a way that was acutely damaging in the long term to British rule in Ireland. Indeed, Irish Conservatives opposed all measures to widen the electorate and provide for extended democracy for most of the 19th century. It was only towards the end of the century that they discovered that they could be beneficiaries of an extended electorate in Ulster, and in a way that eventually gave them their mandate for partition. Essentially, I would argue that the defeat of the United Irishmen and the suppression of their ideas and those of other radical reformers led to an immensely long winter of arrested development. It's like the perpetual winter in Narnia from C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But eventually that winter broke down. That's why I'm proud to be chair of the Belfast-based organisation Reclaim the Enlightenment, which was founded in 2017, and which draws on our city's progressive era in the late 18th century, and as a trigger for positive interventions in the present. I think I would describe us as civic republicans. We've often broken free from rigid backgrounds and been engaged in other civic arenas. We could be characterized as part of the much vaunted moderate middle of recent years. In fact, we're far from moderate in our insistence on the need for radical reform of many aspects of our society. What do we do? Our 4-year campaign, that to save Belfast's historic assembly rooms for public and cultural uses, achieved a signal success at the beginning of September when Belfast City Council unanimously agreed to purchase the building. We have an active education reform group, which is focusing its campaign on the abolition of the hateful and disastrous transfer test. We're supporters of universal human rights. We are, or at least most of us are, opponents of hereditary monarchy and aristocracy. I think all of us are opponents of slavery and modern racism. We're supporters of freedom of the press and justice before the law. We abhor the ascendancy of the military and industrial complex. How many of you know that that phrase was originally coined by, of all people, President Eisenhower, just at the point that he was giving up the presidency? Even an ostensibly very right-wing Republican president at that time recognized the dangers of the ever-growing military-industrial complex. I think it's in that context that we tend to welcome Ireland's neutrality. We certainly support the rights of the Palestinians and the Ukrainians to self-determination. And if we do that, what about Ireland? Most immediately, what about Northern Ireland? It is now an almost universal judgment that our devolved government is deeply dysfunctional. No doubt, in order to secure peace, it was necessary to establish a framework based on sectarian balance. The experience has shown that as a basis for longer-term government, it has provided a recipe for paralysis. From an enlightened perspective, we should at least argue that democracy is the least worst form of government available to us. All adults here enjoy the right to vote. Thus, as is often said, we get what we vote for, but do we? The misuse of the petition of concern or the right of one party on the executive to veto action by the others can confound the wishes and the beneficial wishes of a majority in all too many cases. It's not as bad as the situation that faced reformers in the 1790s. No way. But it's surely an unsustainable state of affairs. Its structures have to be reformed or it will die. Then coming into focus is the gathering momentum in favour of Irish unity, spearheaded in particular by Ireland's future. I make no bones about it. I would like to see Irish unity in my lifetime, though I would rather suspect that I might have to live to be 100 to see it. And I'm not really sure I want to live to 100. What I'm really saying, I think, is that one bad mistake that's been made by advocates of Irish unity is to keep putting immediate deadlines on when this must happen, say 3 years ahead or 5 years ahead. When the real basis for it happening isn't there, that's pretty deeply unhelpful. The other thing is that I do not think that Irish unity will be achieved by mass rallies, which is rather the habit of Ireland's future. I do recall the utter failure of the Anti-Partition League in the 1940s and 50s. Worse still is the notion that unity can be achieved by demographic change, that the supporters of unity can simply outbreed their opponents. That would be extremely tiring for a start. But even if it was successful, I do remember that in about 1968, there was a guy, I think down in Monaghan, I've forgotten his name, but he was saying in 1968, effectively, we can outbreed them. And those of us who were ne'er-do-wells into people's democracy nicknamed him, oh yes, I know what his name was. We nicknamed him Count the Catholics Corrigan. Well, you know, I mean, people of that kind of thought about how we would get a united Ireland, well, it may be that Corrigan's day is coming, but actually I think that would be the worst way to achieve a united Ireland. It would not guarantee any unity of spirit. It would be one where, you know, numbers simply win. No, I have to accept that numbers will win at the heels of the hunt, but you need a really solid framework, and that's where we get to what's needed. I mean, what is needed is a radical vision of what a united country could be. I note the calls being made for the current government in the Republic to do the preparatory work, but that government is fundamentally conservative and, to my mind, incapable of carrying out the task. Well, if it's up to the rest of us, what should we advocate? Our 18th century Enlightenment pioneers and the United Irishmen can certainly help, but more than 200 years on, we need to build on that. We do already have a unity in one Greek sense, in the profound inequality as between rich and poor in both jurisdictions. We need to proclaim the case for a far-reaching rebalancing, which must involve taxing the rich to help build a more equal society, to repair our broken public services, and to provide an infrastructure fit for purpose, both north and south. That may sound like socialism or even communism, but however much one may commend the United Irishmen, they were at best precursors of those ideologies. In any case, we need to build far wider alliances to have any chance of success. We in Reclaim the Enlightenment do annually celebrate Bastille Day, as our forebears did. We do so as an opportunity to express our hopes for change. But of course, we do so in full awareness that the French Revolution failed utterly to fulfill its initial promise. We do meet in bleak times. The United Irish belief that revolutions were the natural and inevitable means of human progress proved to be deeply flawed. The notion that it was some kind of automatic mechanism proved as reliable as faith in the second coming. What we can say is that historically empires rise and fall. In the case of Britain, France, and Russia, their empires have fallen, and we're merely living with the long and ugly tail end of that process. American hegemony cannot last forever, and may be on the way to self-destruction as we meet. Dictators always fall. We must seek to assist these processes. Let us hasten a new dawn. Thank you very much.